So, comrades, Leon Trotsky once said that war is the locomotive of history. Now, what if the locomotive could be the locomotive of history? And that is generally the thesis of how the railways can fix the future. And today I am joined by the author, Gareth Dennis. Gareth, welcome to the show.
Hello, not even how they can fix the future, how they bloody will fix the future. That's the thesis. How they will fix the future. That's the key message. Is that they're like unavoidably through where we've been led by all the stupid mistakes we've made as a species over the last quite a number of decades, centuries, millennia? Question mark. Read the book. That actually the railways are the tool that we need. They have been a tool for evil, but absolutely they remain the tool we need to survive the future. And this is the book that I've been wanting to write for a long time, and Repeater have given me the opportunity, which is really cool. Yes, hi, I'm Gareth Dennis. I'm a railway engineer and writer, and I present to you how the railways will fix the future. I should hold my advanced copy too and wave it around. Here it is. There it is. Very proud of it. Thanks, Johnny, for this beautiful cover. Evocative of quite a lot of things, all railway timetables and. I'm very pleased. It looks wonderful in physical form as well. I'm really pleased.
It is a cracking bit of kit, and I must say, incredibly readable. I didn't realize I got for the first 100 pages till I finally looked down at the numbers. And let's start off. In terms of they're going to fix the future, but what's the problems they're trying to fix here? And this is a big question because they fix a lot of problems. Because there's various areas to get into in terms of the problem of human transit generally, which we can see, of course, in I'd say migration crises, but it's more of a crisis of access and people not letting him in than rather than having ways to do so. But even in the sense of the impact of climate change, and even to the most bog standard function of railways, which is communication. I mean, can we get into some of the core problems that this book is a response to?
Yeah, certainly. So people often shout at me for kind of invoking the omni threat, but as you explore, to be honest, as you explore any subject in detail, you find yourself kind of just knocking on the ultimate on the doors of like class consciousness, and so anyone who really follows, often, and I'm circumnavigating because I will get to your question, but often when I'm in conversations, particularly as in my role as a journalist within the industry, which is the role of journalism and where people think the dotted line between following evidence to a logical conclusion and party politics and partisanness, that dotted line is in a very weird place, particularly in B2B type industry stuff. But it's quite interesting that sits around, particularly as one of the rare things of like an outwardly, out leftist in kind of business to business writing circles. I write other stuff as well. You find yourself realizing that all these things are connected. And I suppose the biggest one absolutely has to be climate change, has to be global warming, as it's kind of not often termed anymore. The heating of the planet, the massive threat that our changing climate represents to us as a species, to all the other species on the planet, to every biosphere on the planet, to every way of life, and critically, the impact it has on every single other problem that we as a society have created for ourselves. So the big one is that as every country reaches a certain point of development, I don't want to use developed and non-developed countries as a bit of a reductive description, but as every country kind of reaches a certain point, a threshold of development, if you like, transport becomes the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. So for most of Europe now, transport is the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. It's true in the US, it's true in lots of parts of the world. Transport, large source of greenhouse gas emissions. So on the big ticket item of make less carbon go into the atmosphere, we have to tackle transport. There's no avoiding it. That's a key thing. The trouble is the way that we're currently talking about that happening, which is just do everything the same except put batteries in it, or worse, more electric cars, causes serious problems. And you see from this example of like one thing of, well, if we just do status quo transport, you start seeing a cascade of the other issues that climate change impacts on. So you go down through mineral dependence, child labor and child slavery, you go through societal loneliness, you go through the fact we have an aging population, you go through the impacts on disabled people, people disabled by the environment around them, and very much disabled by the car-centric environment we have built around our kind of developed, kind of our populated areas. And so you see this cascade through everything. So yeah, you start with So I dare say I could pick something else. A better leftist might have started with class consciousness and gone, emancipation of the working class. But actually, I didn't. I started with CO2, as I talk about in the book. Actually, it's key to get the right incentive, and in a way, that the incentive that started off the cascade in the book of all these other issues was right. If we're going to tackle the big one, which is global warming, which is reducing our greenhouse gas emissions to net zero as quickly as we possibly can, what else do we have to think about to achieve that? And in doing so, you have to start thinking about all those other things of class consciousness, of the plight of working people, of those less well off and non-elites. And it kind of cascades right through. So that's kind of the starting point, and it cascades through all sorts. We end up talking about cybersecurity and climate resilience of infrastructure. We start talking about sort of corporate espionage. We go through gadget bans, sort of bullshit stuff that we try and get sold on by the tech industry. We talk about tech utopianism. We kind of go through a huge number of things in the book on this kind of weaving meander. Well, you've said readable, which is very kind of you. So hopefully this fairly well tied together sort of meandering trip through both a geographical trip and sort of kind of a narrative trip through all these various challenges, and how we come back to railways as being the way that we fix all of them.
But it makes sense that it was brought out in that way, because insofar as railways are like a dominant vehicle of communication, and literally in the way which Europe in its imperialist hostility sort of commune with other places across the world.
Yeah.
When you can't talk about communication and the structures that make it possible without and this isn't just me being a continental philosopher making a pun here, excommunication. Communication, munus, Latin root, obligation, the obligation we have together. Who can participate in that communication? Those structures includes the very things that the communication has an obligation to the people it binds together. And if you can't bind them together, an obligation of universal service provision, as things like the rails and the post office used to have, well, actually, no, it's called universal service obligation, isn't it? I think, remember, originally. Then you're cutting people out of it straight and foremost. So I think if you're going to take like a paradigm technology that everyone apart from your occasional rural sort of like Range Rover mum sort of style psychopath would deal with, you're going to have to deal with something like the trains.
Yeah,
and
I was going to say there's no avoiding it. It's interesting you talk about communication because, the railways in their infancy were kind of the next step in industrial communication and industrial networks that in a way for capitalism to find a new frontier. We just as the railways ramped up, the industry that was slavery was ramping down. Certainly in terms of the transatlantic slave trade. So we were seeing this. It's no coincidence; they are utterly connected. That one industry was seen as at its sort of sunset, and another was seeing as sunrise. That this mass, not just of capital from sort of the compensation paid by Western governments, by the government of the British Empire, particularly to slave owners, not to the slaves themselves, but to slave owners, meant there was quite a bit of capital sloshing around, for sure. But that wasn't the only reason why the railways boomed. We had railways, as I talk about in the book. A key myth I want to bust is that railways started in sort of 200 years before 2025. They did not start in 1825. The railways preceded that by centuries. But the modern railway, the birth of the modern railway as we see it, was in 1830 onwards. Very clear line threshold, and that was because of this move, not just of capital at finding a new frontier, but also of all the people, all the clerks, all the business networks, all of the merchants, all of the buildings, the warehouses even of this former industry coming down and transferring into the new industry, this new frontier of railways. And the reason the railways, that line of communication, thrived at that point is from some fundamentals that we can now harness for good today, and have done so already. The railways have not been a uniform evil up to this point. We've seen railways being used for good, but in order to understand and harness those railways for good, we have to understand where they came about. It's interesting to talk about communication. I mean, firstly, communication and the ability to move us and our knowledge around is a fundamental human right, and it is a human need that dates back as far back as we have existed as a species. Our intent to migrate, our intent to move around is absolutely innate to us, as much as food, shelter, and safety. The other thing, so railways are kind of key. Railways, if we're going to unleash mobility and indeed continue to have mobility, free mobility that isn't limited by our need to reduce carbon emissions, in order to maximize that ability and not just basically entrench the status quo and mean that well-off people are the ones who can travel and all of the rest of us be damned. The railways, those fundamentals that make railways very good, by the way, the most efficient way of moving people and things across land, the most energy efficient by a long way, and materials efficient and space efficient as well. The railways can't beat that, so railways are the tool. What's also interesting, so railway communication, fundamental right, railways clearly key to that. What's also interesting is we talk about communication as in modern communications, telecommunications, speed of light communications as a direct outcome of the railways quite early on. In fact, very soon after the railways started expanding, we saw light speed communications popping up, and so the story of, if you like, the tech industry as we know it today is kind of absolutely intertwined with the railways in a way the tech industry probably would rather we forgot, which is quite interesting. These threads, all the way you have to see, just as history, as with any subject, I'm strongly against the idea, this Whig history idea, that, and it comes up in railways. You have roads, and then you have canals, and then you have railways, and then you have roads again, and like there's this straight line Whig view of history that runs through it, which is absolute bobbins, and that is absolutely true. That's absolutely true with history, as it is with any subject. Actually, it's just a complicated spider with a load of mini post-it notes attached to it. You wiggle one thread, and all the others wiggle and jiggle in a certain pattern, and it's spotting that pattern and the way they all wiggle and jiggle in relation to each other that helps you see a way forwards. That's true for history as it is for kind of policy domains and making sweeping judgments about policy to improve people's lives, or perhaps not to improve people's lives. So that, and again, the book tries to. I try and. It's a book. Let's wobble it around again for the benefit of viewers and listeners. I'm wibbling the book around. We're both wibbling our copy of the book around because this is the third now. I lost one of my advanced, the particularly nice tatty version. I lost in a Greg's in Derby Station, which was then picked up by someone and photographed and sent to me, which was very nice. Then the version after this, I ended up accidentally giving to someone who said, "Oh, can I have a copy of the book?" And I was like, "You're in it." So I guess, I probably ought to give you one. So I did. So this is my third personal copy that'll be the one I thumb and read out of at some point in the future, I'm sure. But anyway, so this book. So as I wobble this around, it tries to be not just talking about how we make railways good, but also how we can use railways. So it's the railways are part of the future. They're in fact a key tool in us surviving the future, but also how can we use railways as a lens through which to view kind of other policy domains, other kind of themes of politics as well. Sorry, I've gone off on one there. For anybody wondering what the book reads like, kind of like this, I suppose, as I point to my own mouth, it kind of like a bit of a rolling, but you said it's readable, which again, I'm reassured by. It's the first kind of review I've heard of someone else actually reading it and saying that it's readable. That's
it's better than just readable. I don't that would not be my final word on it. I mean, one of the things I do want to praise about it is particularly the way in which it communicates that where the question of using the technology is itself a political act, insofar as, I mean, in contrast to, as you said, the tech bros who keep reinventing the train, such as, Musk with Loop and Hyperloop, which I know are different, but ultimately still, they're very consistent on the plane of being utter bollocks.
Yeah, so that's the key point.
Tech bro bollocks of all flavors. But in terms of politicizing, and I'm going to use communications of base as a jump off again, because I think the politicization here that you really are very good in achieving is sort of highlighting how essentially the sort of Tony Benn question of how do we get rid of you and like who do you work for, particularly in terms of what in terms of the question, for example, like imperialist use of trains. You build a train line that goes from the resource to the dock, and trains essentially as a vehicle for capital being able to leg it.
Exactly.
Which is typically how the British have used them, and not just British, but we started it. We should have most of the blame. I was going to talk about Ironbridge here, as I am being historical materialist in that extent, but particularly in terms of who the trains allow to communicate, because the extent of which most people, when they use trains, especially in a big city like London and surrounding towns, they're not communicating, they're commuting. The capital is communicating to itself in a way through them. The boss is communicating to them. That is a way of capital sort of speaking to itself, and then, as it usually does, making more money off the friction with your Cornish pasty companies and your Cafe Neros and the like, and your exorbitant train fees. Because my phone dies, well, that's not my problem. So you made it this way. Sorry,
exactly.
Rant about the trains. So, I mean, how do we think about the trains as a political technology then? Again, I'm going far too bloody abstract, but it's hard not to because it's such a function.
Well, the thing is, when you talk about a concept as grandiose as how we move about and how we communicate, so that's logistic. It's really key. And one of the things I catch myself in the final part of the book is when I moan that I don't think I've talked enough about logistics in the book. Actually, I've talked a lot about how humans move around and how our ideas can move around. But actually, one of the things I perhaps don't talk about enough, and there's plenty more to be explored, is basically what the euphemism, freight, logistics, moving stuff around. And all of these are an allegory, absolutely. For it's very difficult. In fact, it's pointless and useless to abstract ourselves from, to suggest that the tools of which we move us, our ideas, and our stuff around are in some way an inert thing that just happens to be, right? And I'm afraid the reason I'm perhaps quite blunt about this in the book, because I'm afraid quite a lot of commentary about railways, whether it's history. Some of the more popular historians who've written about railways, not all, but some of the, let's say, pop historians, specifically pop historians, but also lots of people who talk about them presently, like a lot of the influencers who talk about railways, and those who kind of perhaps not profit off, but build some platform on, aren't railways nice, whether they're travel correspondents or whether they're just going around talking about, and I'm not necessarily talking about any specific individuals here, if even though people might read into it as such. They all try and suggest railways are this, you can just ignore everything that's gone before and railways exist as this abstract thing. And that's never been true. In fact, the thing that makes them interesting, even from a historiological perspective, the thing that makes railways interesting is not, and I'm saying this as a nerd, I have a bloody Pandrel clip behind my head. There is a Pandrel clip behind me, which is a very basic element of the modern, well, not even modern, actually, the 1960s permanent way, the track itself. My profession is the nuts and bolts. But the nuts and bolts are not the thing. They're in and of itself the politics of why that Pandrel clip that's over this shoulder. Well, that's going to be my bit for this whole episode, isn't it? Pointing the wrong side of my shoulder. The very nuts and bolts are political. Why that thing became the thing that we build railways with is in and of itself a political story. So the rails are political. Everything about the system is. Why did railways start ending up happening in the UK? It's not because we're geniuses in any way. It just happens to be that not happens to be at all. It's no coincidence that we happen to have a workforce and a geography and a mineral resource that we could combine and exploit in such a way that allowed us to start rolling bits of iron and putting on top of wooden rails that were everywhere in the world. And so we kind of started cornering the market in that sense because of a pure coincidence that we then that was allowed to be exploited by the nature of the society that it appeared in. We cannot abstract the railways from the history and the context within they sit and the political realities in which they sit. It's as true for, this is true. Again, I hammer this nail repeatedly with an oversized mallet because it's a problem that we see with the politics of railways today. When the UK's high-speed rail network, its only real knock on the door of a strategy was cancelled in its almost total entirety by our previous Prime Minister Rishi Sunak by the way, not as a statement to the House of Commons, not as a policy announcement with some context, as a bit in one of his big speech at his own party's conference in Manchester, the cancellation of HS2, High Speed 2. It was done as very much a political tool in desperation to build. To attempt to rebuild some sort of electoral coalition with the kind of the traditional Tory heartlands that had been lost to the Lib Dems, and even in some cases to the Greens, but certainly very much lost to the Lib Dems. And I had the number of people within the rail industry and within the rail industry commentariat and within journalism going, well, of course, HS2 has been cancelled because it costs too much. turning it into some technocratic statement rather than what. Are you gaslighting me? It was cancelled by the PM as pork barrel politics in a desperate move to attempt to win enough or to be honest, not even as an electoral move. Really, it was as a job interview to Policy Exchange or to some of the Californian right wing think tanks that Rishi Sunak knew he would have to be applying for a job with in fairly short shrift. So we still today have the problem of people abstracting and distancing themselves from the politics. I know that's a fairly on-the-nose capital P politics example, but it feels like an important one to kind of make that point why we have people continuing to pursue this abstract point, and it happens with all sorts. It happens with train accidents where people try and pull the politics out and say, well, you're making this about politics. Like, yeah, because it is politics is why this happens. And suggesting otherwise will basically stop us from solving the problems. Ultimately, I'm an engineer. I want to solve the problem. Right? That's my training. I through my blood, I am an engineer, and I want to solve. Well, actually, engineering it's reductive to say engineers solve problems. What engineers do is we take a problem and we turn it into an idea. That's kind of what engineering is about. And for me, that idea is, well, how do we actually make best use of these bits and pieces, these apparently benign bits and pieces, and actually make use of them? In and of itself, very much a political act. So yeah, I get angry by that depoliticization, and in a sense that comes back to the kind of the materialist view of railways, right? And again, I have to be very careful because I'm not a theorist on this. I'm not a leftist theorist. So I find myself treading in deep waters. I come to my kind of leftism, if you like, from a bit of an empirical position of how do I take the railways and as I see it, solve a lot of the problems that are really critical, as we talked about earlier, and kind of you follow that to its nth degree. You cross that dotted threshold of the political line where you move into partisan politics rather than sort of, like just following evidence to its end point. Cross that threshold, and that's brought me to the politics that I have, not just in terms of railways, but obviously the bigger picture. Some of the other serious challenges that we've created for ourselves that and I talk about in the book, and I tie them in. And again, when I talk about the omni threat, the impact on marginalized people in society, whether it's people of color, whether it's trans people, whether it's whoever it is who's getting beat down on for a very specific purpose. As a distraction from us being kind of used and abused to forward capital's aims, is absolutely key to railways. And hopefully it doesn't feel like I'm, unlike just as I just did in this podcast, in the book, hopefully it doesn't feel like I'm leaving it in. It's really critical that if we want a railway that serves everyone, it must serve and therefore be staffed by and developed by and led by people who represent everyone. That's a really key point. And so again, that comes back to the politics of this thing. And again, often the railways, the abstraction of the railways from the reality kind of excludes that, often tries to hide away from that point.
Well, I mean, in terms of the politicization of engineering, I mean, absolutely. I mean, the way I understand it, at least, the engineer is essentially the negotiator between the map and the territory.
Yes.
And usually with political plans, they tend to be, well, the map is the territory, and if it isn't, we will simply provide someone who can. And this is kind of the model of neoliberal politics, because because negative feedback is completely lost. I mean, when was the last time anyone said no to Elon Musk? It wasn't a divorce proceeding. And I think that is generally the model for any of these people. I mean, in terms of the negotiating of the map and the territory here, the map provided to us by most of our politicians, one is, as you said with HS2, is mostly just advertising for themselves, or, oh, look, this took way long because it's been sold to, I don't know, Circa or Korean or whatever fuckwit company. But the map that really trying to impose also as well, and also even then, not particularly well, is all in service of the hegemonic and in a way sort of both most highly politicized and most depoliticized mode of transport, which is car brain, as you describe it. Can we get into the hegemony of the car and some of the myths here? Because it's individualizing. I'm not going to go over the full Adorno and say that the way we close the car door is fascist, because I mean, he's actually right half the time. Because half the time we're not even getting into our own car, we're getting into someone else's who's had a poor precaritized Uber driver or something. Yeah. But how do you think the car ideology really shapes our attitudes towards the railways?
Yeah, and I don't want to hijack this as if I've come to it, myself as some sort of grand epiphany. Lots of people have written about this before, and I reference a paper in or rather the word motor normativity. I reference that word in the book because it's come from a series of papers that it's a bit of an academic word for just car brain. But also, I want to shout out to Paris Marx. Their book is absolutely excellent on the way that the tech industry has toxified everything, but particularly movement. Road to Nowhere, very, very worthwhile book to read, and talks a lot about tech utopianism and how it ties in with, it's kind of a continuation of the automotive industry's capture of liberal governments through the interwar years. In fact, as early as the interwar years. In fact, you can probably trace it earlier than that. But if you want the detailed read on that, absolutely, Paris, their book is fantastic, and their writings generally on this fantastic. But I pull this up and I carry it further a little bit by bringing it into the context of the wider transport system in relation to railways, and the impact on railway policy. And again, we can talk about pick it up in the UK, but also the US, of course, is kind of the harbinger of doom when it comes to the kind of the distilled essence of car brain. the car brain, that, if we like, when we're saying car brain, what we mean is it's not just the fact that driving a car makes you insanely angry and want to murder cyclists. It's talking about if you like, it's the pool of kind of collective thought of a lot of interests, whether it's the oil industry, the fossil fuel burning industry, who are like, what are things that we like to sell? Okay, oil, yep. Plastics, okay, yeah, rubber, okay. Well, what's a way how can we maximize the sale of these things? Oh yeah, by pinning a single engine and 2 tons worth of metal, but in particular plastics, and put all that and make it burn oil to move around. I don't allude to it quite in the book actually, but it's worth saying. I allude to it, but I don't go into detail. Battery cars had been around since as early as the internal combustion engine. We've had battery cars. There's a reason that has kept being delayed and offset. These interests, even today, we see that the fossil fuel industry is lobbying the EU to the tune of hundreds of millions of euros to push hydrogen as a solution, not just for automotive industry, but also for generally for heating our homes, for to desperately keep us using their hegemonic technologies, their networks, their fuel, their gas pipelines and such. Even though hydrogen does not travel through those gas pipelines very well, that's another story. So I'm getting ahead of myself. So there's this hegemony on how we move around and the way that society needs to be reshaped to facilitate that. So I go back to the fact, I allude to, we can allude to the invention of jaywalking as which in and of itself actually is kind of a bit of a racial slur. The invention of these things, these tools to normalize murdering children at the rate of thousands a year, which was happening in the US and continues to happen in the US. As a result of cars, we've just normalized a pandemic. Actually, it's an epidemic. It's not a pandemic, it's an epidemic. We've normalized that it's okay in the UK for us to kill and maim 25,000 people a year, severely, life-changing injuries or death for 25,000 people a year. If the railways was doing that, right, they'd just be you'd turn the key and walk away. But obviously that's not, the car has been made to be an eminent part of our functioning society, and the way that capitalism continues is that the car, it comes with, you get the same arguments for capitalism as you do for cars, which is, without the car / capitalism, we wouldn't have achieved all the great things we've achieved today. We wouldn't have achieved all these great emancipations and freedoms and all this and stuff, and be damn grateful for it. But actually, if you trace back, you look at the proliferation of suburbs, the proliferation of urban development as a whole in the interwar years, into the early, into kind of the mid to latter part of the 20th century, and the changes to our built environment, absolutely nowhere more typifying this than some of the cities. Detroit as a key example in the US, where you just have entire city centers leveled in as people drop to their knees in aid of moving the car around. Everything else absolutely secondary to moving and storing the car. And it's frightening. Some of those aerial images of Detroit before and after are frightening. It's more damage than we could inflict with bombs or with any other tool we have. It's absolutely staggering. And that change has filtered. Sorry, I'm getting away from the technocratic. That change has filtered through everything. It's filtered through our politics. It's filtered through. It was seen as a way to break up the strength of the unions that had been building so much in the interwar years, as people came out of the First World War going, "What the fuck's the deal with this?" and deciding that they were going to take matters into their own hands a bit, as we saw through the interwar years, particularly during the Great Depression. And the car was seen as a way to break that up, to individualize society, particularly in the US and in Europe, to individualize society such that it became very difficult for us to organize. We became very lonely. We became very easy to, as you say, to absolutely individualize, and therefore, towards the end of the 20th century, financialize everything. Absolutely everything. And I don't want to tread out into deep theory, but this is very much about the capitalism gaining its worth from the friction it creates, as you kind of referred to earlier. As I say, if we're going to make it full circle, HS2. And politicizing HS2 and saying, well, it's just so difficult to deliver HS2. It's a technocratic reason, because engineering the engineering is very expensive, and that's why it's like, no, it's because the UK has deliberately shaped its entire economy around not doing things. We believe our gods and masters. Well, no, the economy is God. Our masters are treasury. They believe, and the Adam Smith Institute. They believe that the best thing for our economy, wrongly, is to create as many shards as possible, so that all the interfaces between the shards. All of those can compete with each other, and therefore you get the maximum competition. Therefore, I'm shaking my head as I say it. Competition between, and therefore improvements to all of us and what we have on offer. But also that you extract the maximum revenue, whether it's private or public revenue, from having the maximum number of shards. The trouble with that approach to an economy is that it can't. It's all very well. In fact, it doesn't even work for the financial industry, but it might well seem like it works for the financial sector. But when it comes to delivering things or services, that doesn't work. It just makes it all broken. It slows it all down. It inserts lots of people into the process, which means nothing works. No clear incentive structure, no clear lines of command, no accountability, and therefore no delivery of either the physical thing like a railway or the public service. So it's really key that so that attitude of shatter everything into pieces. In a way, you can trace it right back to the rubbing of the hands between the kind of the three-way handshake between the automotive industry, neoliberal hawks as they were not called then, just capitalists at the time, the automotive industry, the fossil fuel industry, those who did not want unions to have power, they did not want people, us, to have power. This was seen as a wonderful way to make us think that the best thing for us was to build everything around our bubble. And you see that with the Just Stop Oil protesters getting run over by a Range Rover mom because she is in her safe metal box, the Cybertruck. It's a safe, bulletproof metal box. We can all exist in our tiny little abstracted box. And for various other, among a million other reasons, the good thing about the railways is that they smash this to bits. We travel among our friends, our siblings, our colleagues, our co-conspirators, and we see what the world is like, which is far greater when we're sharing it with others. And I feel very strongly, I want the book not to be seen as anger and misery, and I try and make sure that the back half of it is, or certainly the back third of it, is a positive note, or maybe it ends up being the back fifth. But in any case, because there's a lot of misery to get. Well, not misery. There's a lot of deconstruction before reconstruction to get through, right? But I want to end it, and I'm sure we'll get there again and talk about it in a sec. But I just want to, the book is intentionally optimistic by its end, because the railways give us an opportunity to reconnect with each other, both physically and sort of socially.
No, absolutely. I mean, in terms of the historical function of cars, I did disavow calling them fascist, but actually, if you think about what Henry Ford's plans were, it was not only that you would leave your house as an individual subject enclosed within a car, basically a home away from home. In the same way that, and I can't remember the paper now, people talk about the phone as kind of being like, if you just start looking at your phone, it's like you've gone home for a bit. You've sort of gone into your sort of state group chat, you've got your sort of immediate comforts there. But the home you'd be leaving under Fordist capitalism is one that, as Ford liked to do, was incredibly racialized. Insofar as he literally would split up immigrant communities into, this is Hungary town, this is Poland town, this is German town. It is based into you. Not only are you individualized on the way out, you are racialized on the way in, and so it's harder to shake that boundary. And absolutely, I mean, in terms of finding ways of positive relationship to the train, I mean, I was thinking about this when I was reading the book yesterday, and I want to compare the atmosphere of a train to a car. A car's atmosphere is essentially a kind of individualized misery these days, and a train's atmosphere feels a bit more like the kind of solidarity I felt being in like the waiting room at A&E. Sort of like everyone sort of looking around going like, it's all good. Sometimes we actually help each other out to that extent. Less so on the tube, which is almost, I don't know, tubes maybe have some sort of car-like function if you want to speculate there. But it really does.
We could get. I'm sure we could do. I could write a whole extra book on why that is, but maybe the next one.
A latent kind of misery, but I got it so far. This is only really part. This is only really part one of the book. There is a plan here. Which makes it a fucking rare book from any leftist publisher, any leftist thing. There is actually a plan. It is not a 5-year plan. It is a 10-point plan. I'm just going to read the points of this plan out. We're not going to go through all of them, listeners, because this is a preview, and you should go buy the rest of the book. But I've highlighted a few actually. So the plan so far: point 1, set the mission. Point 2, redistribute power. Point 3, restructure the industry. Point 4, create the timetable. Point 5, map the network. Point 6, plan for change. Point 7, build the workforce. Point 8, harness automation. Point 9, maximize access. And point 10, deliver resilience. Now, we're not going to go through all of those, as I just said, but I want to sort of, if we can go sort of a quick, that's not quick fire, we've got half an hour, we can go as long firing as we'd like. But I want to start with, point number 9 about maximizing access, because I think that's one of the things that and it's easy just to sort of start loving the tech, but I think it's easy to sort of lose that aspect here, because ultimately one of the people the railway excommunicate the most is absolutely the disabled, particularly through the staff closures, lack of ticket offices. One of the places near me, Theresa May promised there'd finally be a fucking elevator. There is no elevator, and there never will be at this rate. I mean, what does it mean? How can we be positive in terms of the ways in which we can we can communicate with everyone or at least with the working class. We don't necessarily want to communicate with the head of Deutsche Bahn, whoever. They can go fuck themselves. They can drive. How do we? What is the aspect of point 9 here that's taking us forward into a more positive vision for how they will fix the future?
Yeah, so I touch on a few points in the kind of the sub chapter, if you like, or the chapter that breaks that point open, and I use one key case study as an example, but it's only because I know it very, very well and in very great detail, but it acts as a bit of a canard for the bigger picture, which is level boarding, which is the reason I pick it is because it's such an obvious sounding thing to people who perhaps haven't thought on this point for a minute. To be honest, most people who travel by train will have, outside of some very happy, lucky people who just stick to cities that have entire level boarding systems. What I'm referring to is building a railway that allows people to independently get from the platform onto the train. So, you talk about lifts. It's all very well building lifts onto your station or down into your underground system. And God, we bloody well should be doing that, whether it's lifts or also kind of in the UK particularly, like stop thinking of subways as some sort of route to hell and actually build more subways that are cheaper and, kind of certainly less land take to actually get people over and under railways. But you get people onto the platform and then they have no way of actually getting onto the train as it pulls up. So, or indeed getting off the train and ending up somewhere else. That is a fundamental. Railways cannot fix the future if a fifth of people or more. And by the way, most parts of the world now are reaching the point where we have aging populations. So this is everyone, absolutely everyone, buggies, luggage. But critically, we should keep the focus on accessibility for people disabled by the environment around them. Is actually getting on trains, and level boarding is one way of doing this. And I do broaden out and refer to other elements as well. Things like wayfinding and how people, ticket facilities, the complexity of the ticketing system, making the railway system, maximizing access is, first and foremost, we should be making sure that it's accessible to everyone. And that covers disability, but also we need to think about race, income levels. So I talk about fares to an extent. It really, we cannot use the railways and build a future in which the railways are the key way people move around if we're not letting people use them. That's a really fundamental point, and it merits some focus. And so within that chapter, I kind of break down. I use a few different kind of themes that I sit in, but the main core that I stick with is explaining this level boarding concept, because it allowed me to get a bit techie, because it's useful to get techie. It's useful to pick on some of the nuts and bolts a little bit here and there to kind of show how some of those issues work. This book, I hope, will be read by a lot of wonks, journalists, kind of high-level folks who maybe find the technical stuff kind of interesting. But also, there'll be plenty of nerds who are reading this who love the technical stuff and want to kind of get more of that. So I've written this book for both of those groups of people. And level boarding was a good facilitator of that. And also, for me, I'm one of the co-founders of the campaign for level boarding in the UK. It's something that I'm really passionate about, and it would have been just a ridiculous thing for me not to address that head on within my first book about railways or anything, to be honest. So it's a really key feature, and it felt really important to pick up.
No, absolutely. I mean, in terms of particularly in terms of emboldening access, I mean, level boarding and also staff. Let's go to point 7 then, in terms of building the workforce. Yeah. How do you think the way that the workforce needs to change? Obviously, I'm assuming. I'm saying obviously because maybe just me being depressive about it, but I'm assuming there's a lot of precaritized labor in the rail workforce,
yes,
or particularly people probably being relatively nomadic, moving throughout multiple stations, quite disrupted workflows. How do you think we can restructure the workforce, indeed workers' power, in order to embolden the railway structure.
Yeah, and there's a reason why I listed out those 10 points in a particular order, because to know what size of workforce you need, well, let's flip that on its head. You cannot know what shape of the workforce you need, certainly not in a safe and secure, basically in such a way that the people do not feel precaritized or feel precarious in their position. You cannot do that without a plan. So you need the plan, and to get the plan, you need to know what the strategic aim is, which I talk in the book about how you pick that. So you get this. So the reason I've got the 10 points listed in the order is because they all feed off each other in kind of generally in that order. But the workforce, addressing your point head on, absolutely is precaritized at mass. Even people on full-time contracts are beholden to large-scale political decisions like the cancellation of HS2 or the decision to, post-COVID decision that we're going to run fewer trains on certain routes and not reinstate those timetables. So people who felt like they had a secure place in the railways to work actually ended up not. And of course, all the stuff about ticket office replacement. Conscious that this discussion is quite UK focused. To anyone listening to this outside the UK, do not worry. The book, whilst having quite a bit of focus in the UK because it's what I know best, I make a point of it being kind of as internationalized as possible, and we do allude to stuff, challenges across the world in a few case studies as well. But in the case of precarious workers, yeah, definitely. And the 0 hours contracts that are relied on not just in terms of the front line of the railway, whether it's people in stations, but also, of course, in building and sustaining that railway as well, it is really key. We cannot, without that plan, we cannot know what size of workforce we need. But critically, when we do know what size of workforce we need, we have to move away from the status of, and this is certainly in the case of the US and the UK railways, and to a greater extent others, to no lesser extent rather, others as well, is that the railways are run on goodwill. They're run on the goodwill of the staff that operate them, because they run on the goodwill of, well, people, these people, they love the railway, they want to get people moving safely, so we can exploit that and get them to work. Don't get me wrong, overtime will always have a place to fill in gaps and deal with things like, there always will be overlaps with new trains that require a bit of goodwill in terms of a bit of overtime to kind of deal with some of those, but you use overtime not as a way to run the baseline railway, and that the challenge is that we've relied on goodwill and overtime and pressuring staff, whether directly or indirectly, to run the railway with goodwill, where actually it should just be paid fully, have the support and have more, ultimately getting away with running the railway with fewer staff than we can sustainably. And that's the key thing. One of the challenges we've had in the UK with its railways, and we'll allude to this a couple of times, I do allude to this a couple of times in the book, that British Rail, the state operator, for better or worse, and in some cases for worse, had stripped everything out of the railway in terms of how efficiently it was running. It was running very efficiently, but a lot of that was through some pretty hard battles with organised labour, and not always in British Rail's favour, but also not always in the workers' favour either. But we'd reached a point where we did have a very efficient railway system. Privatisation came along, and there's reasons why it happened. Came along in the early 90s through the mid 90s, and really, when you had a privatised system, there was not much they could. The copper had already been stripped out the walls. There was not much left for them to actually strip back, and so you found that all they had as a lever to wang back and forth and to try and get some more profit for their own coffers, which, by the way, in the railways, was not a huge amount for the train operators, for the landlords who own the trains themselves, sure, but actually for the train operating companies, not quite so much, because they didn't have a huge amount of that one lever. That one lever was staff. That one lever was staff conditions, staff numbers, pressure on staff, and it's not a sustainable way. If we want the railways to fix the future, then the railways have to be a place that staff. Frankly, I don't want to be taking the train in a situation where those maintaining or running the train are doing so stretched, whether it's on fatigue or whether it's on their working conditions being poor. I want them to have train drivers, for example. I want that, and train drivers, perhaps the one example of where it's shown how much unionization works to get good working conditions. Even though I'm not going to undermine the fact they've also been pushed and stretched, and it's right that they've been striking, and there's been action to make sure that their conditions are upheld to an extent. But drivers is one example in the UK, are probably the go-to example of a unionized workforce that have successfully been paid rightly for the skilled work that they do. And I want my train driver to be paid well, because they have everything incredibly complicated, difficult job. And also, if they get it wrong, 1,000 people die. If they really get it wrong, lots of people die when a train crashes. So it's actually very important that we have skilled people. And we saw it through the COVID pandemic, right? We were clapping like seals for these key workers. But actually, what we should have been doing is elevating them and realizing that they should be paid far better, and that they are the ones who hold up and ensure our society continues to function. Realizing that in the context of the railways is really important. So I kind of go through all that in the workforce thing and more besides. So I talk about unionization. I talk about my own union, the RMT. I talk about, but also it's not just about unions, it's about those networks of knowledge are also really important. And although some of the larger professional institutions are perhaps guilty of becoming a bit of a new laboury sort of, when they talk about organised labour, they're pretty iffy. My own professional institution's not too bad on that, actually, but that's probably because they're quite small and still have a decent connection with their staff. But, the likes of the institution of civil engineers, I say, is a bit distant from its staff, and it gets a little bit, but if we say that, we're not going to be invited to the nice party in Downing Street or whatever. That's the professional engineering institutions. So the institutions that allow me to call myself that write my code of ethics, that determine what engineers do. Engineers are not the only workers on the railway, but as an engineer, I feel passionately about us finding the right place within that industry and within the construction industry as a whole. We need networks of knowledge as well as networks of conditions and of safety. And so those networks of knowledge generally are the professional institutions. And I talk a little bit about those as well, although obviously a much stronger focus on organised labour and the unions. So yeah, I touch on all that in that chapter.
Well, yeah, I mean, in that case, sorry to muddle the dialectical unfolding of the points here. But in that case, we might as well ping back to number 2 then, which is about redistributing power. Yeah. And in terms of the power that can shape the railways, the power indeed, is it a power not only to map out a new purpose of the railways, but also the power of negotiation, the power in a way of, I guess, first refusal to sort of take another term from sort of collective bargaining? And what do you think are the challenges that we can see sort of coming ahead, and indeed how do we play a part, and how do the railways play a part in overcoming them? I'm not saying do you have a theory of revolution, please? I'll be going through, this is where all the he's called Wes Streeting, not Wes Railing, and even in that street is definitely not pedestrianised.
Absolutely, It's so this is where a lot of your viewers and listeners will shout at me for not doing good leftist theory, and I'm really sorry. But I do my best to talk about power structures and the fact that this is the most kind of probably the hardest thing in the book that I talk about, because if we don't get this right, everything else, all the other marvelous, wonderful stuff just falls away quickly. And in a way, the reason that the fact that if you build the right power structures, it becomes more difficult to unpick this good stuff is what makes this the hardest, the most difficult but most critical part in the book. So actually setting the objective, we've seen how setting the big aim, so if you like the number 1 bullet point, we've seen how setting that can be done, and therefore actually there's a reasonably straightforward legislative route indeed to achieve that. Creating power structures that lock that in or make it purposeful is the tricky bit, and actually to a greater or lesser extent, we can use the railway's own power structures as an analogy for how those power structures work on a broader basis. Again, it's another time when I found this a useful thing to do in the book, is use railways as an analogy for broader society, because railways are big, complicated, involve lots of people, involve lots of moving parts. And I find myself in agreement with lots of, like, very much either, let's say, apolitical in the sense of, you pull off the Scooby-Doo mask and it's, not left, not right, and it says right. But, people who... let's politely say well-meaning people who kind of advocate for the railways agree with me on this about how you redistribute the power structures in the industry, which is, in a way, is a source of optimism. We should see that there's some common ground that perhaps we can paint a picture of if we get the structure of the industry right, if we get the structure of the pathways of power right, then things work. And actually, there's common cause among perhaps a wider coalition of people than we might have envisaged to achieve that, and we should see that as an opportunity, right? I'm not saying that we go and shake hands and make friends with Wes Streeting. Absolutely, we should not do that. I'm not going to make any more actionable threats about Wes Streeting, but no, we shouldn't do that. But we should. There is common cause, and the rail industry gives us an opportunity to see where that common cause can exist. And perhaps the aims are how we build that common cause. So perhaps bullet point 1 on my manifesto is how we achieve that common cause. So that's why that comes first. When I'm talking about power dynamics, though, when it comes to the railways, that is, the offsetting challenges of devolution versus centralization. So, and there is not a do all devolution or do all or centralization question, not at all. And actually, what the railway offers us is an opportunity to see how you understand where power needs to sit centrally versus, where there are efficiencies and benefits of power sitting centrally versus benefits to power being devolved to regional or even local or even lower groups and structures in society, and how that works. The railways are a good opportunity for that because transport inherently is fractal. So there are elements of that system that it makes no sense for a centralized authority to have any business in caring about. And I think by taking the mission and seeing how the mission, the aim, I'm not Maya Matsukato, although there's plenty she says that's good. I kind of want to slightly, I suppose maybe I am falling into her trap of saying we need mission-oriented government. That's not really what I'm saying. I suppose it's a slightly different point. I'm really talking about not so much the mission, but incentives and getting the right incentives. That incentive can be how we build, right, here's the incentive, and it can be set centrally, but then cascaded. Then understanding, right, okay, so it doesn't make any sense for central government to be in charge of the bus frequencies on this street. So clearly that should be something that's controlled locally. And so you find the right shape of government to control that. And actually that allows you to develop that shape on a broader basis for transport and indeed for other elements of policy. And perhaps that's how you build your structures of government accordingly. And I know what I'm saying all sounds quite ethereal, but that chapter hopefully grounds it quite nicely and kind of explaining if you start from these first principles, it allows you to build those, so there are, for example, technical standards. Physics doesn't change from country to country. So actually centralizing something like that provides efficiencies in not, you don't want every county council developing its own railway standards from scratch. That's clearly ridiculous. So actually those are the sorts of things that benefit very obviously and uncontroversially benefit from being centralized. And indeed, we have a situation right now in the railways where that has been too devolved. It's been devolved to the routes on the railway, and that's created pointless friction and inefficiencies in a way that it ought not to have. So you can see examples where devolution isn't always good. Also, you have to think about the fact that devolution was you cannot abstract from the fact that devolution of the UK was a bit of a George Osborne project, which always means you have to raise red flags about, well, what does that mean? Is that actually devolving power, or is it actually just setting up yet another shield against accountability to say, well, that's not our fault as Treasury. No, that's that combined authority's fault for that thing. So I get into the exploration of all these things and the interaction between these different structures and power structures, and obviously that then leads into the democratization of power to people in how we make choices about what our transport system needs to look like, and therefore our kind of broader society's functionings and how those should look like. And those tie into how we interact, how those power structures interact with organized labor, with collective power. Hopefully in a way that makes sense in the context of the book, but also makes some broader sense and gives us some lessons on a broader sense as to how to build those power structures in a way that makes some sense, perhaps outside of those who are well read on the kind of the theory of struggle and of class struggle, and actually those who are the kind of the stuffy suits who do still want us to have a good railway. Well, we can kind of hold their hands a bit and guide them through all this and show them how actually it makes sense to have a railway structure that perhaps builds on some of these more deep-seated themes about the right way to split power.
No, absolutely. I mean, that democratization, in a way, just is a way of fulfilling the role of the train as a communication device. Because the problem is, to some extent, is that it's only one way. The only way we can communicate with the authorities around trains is, say it sorted in London. Sort of like it's only one way. It's a meaning of barking orders mostly, and there's not really sort of let's say a negative feedback you could provide back to them. I mean, a negative feedback from the workers would. Just even just people noticing if a train driver looks tired or something can prevents, to get very marks with it, the social murder. I mean, for example, the tram disasters in the past few years, overworked drivers falling asleep, and then they individualize it on them. And of course, this very well. The fact that Euston Station is a Hillsborough waiting
about the good Lord Hendy and Euston Station. Yeah. Sadly, I don't have my Say It Sacked mug with me, although other mugs are available from the RailNet shop. No, this isn't. I'm not going to plug my mugs. However, the That's a very key point. And those lines of accountability, actually, it's funny that it happened, I perhaps could have pushed harder on it in the book a bit, is that those lines of accountability that exist, even for those within the industry to report safety issues, are really accountability sinks, in that they are designed, even without intending to be so, they are designed to allow us to have a channel for those negative kind of comments that we have, whether it's close call reporting for safety or whether it's something a bit more structural than that. It allows it to be a bit of a sink. And so some stuff might get action. But the trouble is, all the really big problems, they're all really big structural safety, the social murder, absolutely the social murder challenges that our industry faces, as well as broader society, aren't well suited to being dealt with along any nice line of communication, whether it's through a safety reporting, an independent organization like safety reporting group like CIRAS. Nerd railheads know what I'm talking about. Whether it's reporting them within our own organization's close call processes, whatever it happens to be, those are actually completely useless for something like government has decided not to invest in this major London terminus, and as a result, it is currently unsafe, and it's only going to get more unsafe as every month passes. Why don't we Grenfell allegory alert kind of flashing? And I didn't draw this parallel. Actually, one of the expert witnesses from the Grenfell inquiry himself, Arnold Tarling, drew the comparison of this event where I fairly casually but quite purposefully talked about Euston Station and the challenges at Euston Station in a broad systemic sense of government's decided not to invest and it's having these negative immediate consequences. And that article, kind of fairly softball interview that I did for an article in the Independent earlier this year, eventually got the backup of the then chair of Network Rail. So if you like, the buck stops here guy, the fat controller, who is now, by the way, our rail minister. Great. He basically threatened my employer. I'm now unemployed, hooray. He then threatened my employer to sack me because of the fact that I'd talked about this broad systemic challenge that they didn't have a comfortable answer for. It clearly hit a nerve. It resulted in pressure being applied to me, and which, as a result of that, has thrown the entire safety reporting culture of the industry up in the air. I'm not saying it's destroyed it yet. The industry has still not responded robustly. It's still hoping it goes away without it needing to respond robustly. Let me promise you, rail industry, it's not gone away yet. So the folks who are listening and watching this story, you may be despairing, you may be whooping and shouting and cheering. The story's not over yet. In fact, it's going to get even spicier as we go forwards. But in particular on this one very powerful bus deregulation millionaire, Lord Hendy, who everyone unfortunately, lots of people in the industry think is some sort of guru savior who's going to tie both sides of the House of Lords together and get a bunch of softball legislation through that's going to, and very much using vigorous rabbit ears here, renationalize the railways. This is a story of those structures of power being deliberately set up to, and therefore very upset when they're deliberately set up to avoid real accountability, and the powers that be getting very upset when people find a way to subvert those pathways of disaccountability, if you like. And I'm an example of that. I didn't mean to become a bit of a kind of if I'm not going to call myself a martyr, that's incredibly egotistic and pompous. I decided not to assign an NDA and go public with me talking about safety issues at Euston. Actually, very much from mostly for me, it was from a disability perspective. It's from people who are disabled, people who are in the Euston rush. Anyone who uses Euston will know what I'm talking about, and how that is extremely hostile if you're behind, for example, someone who is not super stable on their feet, or someone who's behind a guide dog, or in a wheelchair, or is partially kind of their sight's not so great. You don't have to be in a wheelchair to be disabled. It's really important to highlight that point. The society around us disables lots of different people in lots of different ways, and the problems at Euston that was fresh in my mind when I gave the interview way back in kind of April. I think it was that I actually gave the interview. Kind of early April. So that was eons ago. But it's manifested itself in the last month, where I've been able to finally, after the horrible process, go public with it and embarrass a lot of very powerful people. And I intend to continue doing so.
It's entirely necessary. I mean, you make the Grenfell allegory. I don't even know if it is an allegory. I think the relations of communication, I think the structures are completely isomorphic, completely translatable. Yep. I mean, people tried to communicate to their quote unquote betters what was going to happen. These people were not responded to, whereas the rich people in Kensington were, to put the cladding up, because these people They were migrants, they were poor, they were racialized, they were working class, they were disabled. They were excommunicated from
Others,
politics.
the pig people, they don't count.
Excommunicated.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
yeah, the real boss is, I mean, when I first sort of, so recently, I think I said this to you, I was listening to The World Airs Your Problem, the episode on the Bethnal Green disaster.
Yep.
And at the end of November talks about the Euston Station. I'm like, oh yeah. Actually, because I have to walk past the Bethnal Green Memorial quite often. I'm thinking, yeah, well, this almost happened again already. I mean, with I remember a few years ago, Oxford Circus tube station, someone knocked over a traffic cone. It made a loud bang. Amazing, there wasn't fatalities were crushed there. These things, I mean, it seems like the government is basically working towards essentially trying to avoid near misses, whether it's the concrete which has the structure of an Aero chocolate bar in a lot of schools. They're essentially just infinitely deferring it. But rather than end on a pessimistic note, let's end with one last final question, because we have been very UK centric, and I apologize, listeners, for that. But there is one last question in terms of what examples do you think we could learn from in other international train system? And in the book, you talk a lot about the Chinese rail system, particularly as well the Russian system and its development of distributing people across low population density areas. And I think it's also another point which I think is really worth just highlighting as well, which is you're very good at undermining the myth of privatization that they create. They fulfill demand, they create demand as well by making these new exploratory routes. But then you highlight, of course, that actually privatization chases demand and therefore be part of it instead of creating it. So do you think you have some positive examples in other international rail systems that we can incorporate?
Yeah, absolutely. And they're kind of one of the gimmicks, if you like, I put into the book is a bit of a top 20 of national railway systems based on comparable data. And, Russia topped that list. I dare say, at pre-full-scale invasion of Ukraine data, I'll point out through various things, brain drain and the destruction of its self-inflicted destruction of its own economy, that might have dropped down. It might well have dropped down the list now, such as the data that I had access to. So, Russia's fantastically successful railway system, again, partly because of broader policy about transport, very important to highlight that railways don't exist in a bubble and cannot thrive in a bubble. The bigger policy has to exist, and some of the historical context. Russia has probably torpedoed the success of its own railway system by the mob leadership of that country. But there's a lot for us to learn about why Russia's railways succeeded, and I think one of the biggest messages is transport has to be looked at as a whole, so that the way that people move around cannot just be, well, we'll make railways good by just having the rail industry think and do its own thing. It has to be part of the wider context. And actually, so we can see successes in China and India. These are also not perfect countries with not perfect railway systems. India has a mixed record on safety. Actually, for the people it carries, a very safe system, but there are major systemic problems on safety that within the Indian system. China's lack of care of what its railway system does to the communities that it passes through when it's expanding it, we can't just ignore it. I'm not going to say, well, the Chinese Communist Party, fantastic. They do all this. They've built this wonderful railway system, and isn't it fantastic? No, because it's not sustainable. It's not. We cannot build a railway system like that. And we've seen what happens when you build Mexico, for example, Tren Maya. You build what might seem to outsiders or train travel influencers like a wonderful new system, has actually wrecked some seriously important biosphere, wrecked the water that a lot of the indigenous populations have to rely on, wrecked a load of human history as well in the process in building that railway. So bulldozing a railway through without caring about the communities and environments that it runs through is not the way forwards. But that doesn't mean that we cannot look at the approach China has taken, which is they went, what railway do we need to have? We are now going to build that railway. And they've done it very, very quickly. There's a huge amount of good engineering knowledge that we can learn from how they've done it, but they've also really taken a lot of the engineering knowledge from the rest of the world and kind of assimilated it and applied it. So it's not that they have done something radically new engineering-wise. They've shown kind of what happens if you prioritize the strategic vision, the existing tools we have to deliver that vision, and kind of let it run. And as I said, imperfectly, certainly at the expense of a lot of people, a lot of communities. But there are lessons for us to learn there. India the success of its major strategic programs baffling, incomprehensible scale of, for example, railway electrification. Huge schemes of railway electrification. In a way, they're about to embark on the high-speed rail construction version of that. Again, Modi is an ethno-fascist, not a good person. Not in lots of cases, certainly national level, not a good government. Lots of good regional governments, worth saying. But the Indian Railways does have several key strategic missions, and it is and objectives, and it is delivering against them. Also, countries that perhaps have lots of elements that we don't want to learn from, but it is worth saying that the Swiss and Austrian railway systems can teach us an enormous amount about people might be wondering, why is the timetable one of the big manifesto things in the list that you listed earlier? Well, actually, because it tells us everything about what we need. If we know how you deliver the strategic aim, you build up how many trains you need on each bit of railway, and then in order to fit those together, you need a timetable, and that timetable allows you to know what infrastructure you need to deliver the trains. So the timetable is really critical. Also, staffing, of course, comes from that. Switzerland, with its TACT plan, tying all of its public transport together into one integrated timetable, and critically, not a complicated one like we have in the UK. So we have built a timetable around our infrastructure, assuming that we aren't going to do anything to it. The Swiss built the timetable first and then said, right, our infrastructure works for the timetable here. It doesn't work for the timetable here. So we have to do physical work to the infrastructure, whether it's, dedicated bus lanes or whether it's new railways, or actually in Switzerland, not a huge amount of new railway, but railway upgrades to facilitate the timetable. So a lot to learn from Switzerland on that front in how and they also get the balance of railway policy and broader transport policy, but far more successfully. Things like you cannot drive HGVs across the country. Essentially, it's a little more complicated than that. But that's one thing that drives the right behaviours in having a freight network that is extremely successful in Switzerland. And the measure that I use, and I know I've not mentioned it at all in this interview, which is silly, because it is the key mission, the key objective, the key strategic incentive that everything has to come from, which is modal share. So that is the percentage of people and things moving by rail versus road and air. Switzerland develops its whole structure around maximizing that, and that there's a reason why Switzerland and Austria are high up the list. Is because they have developed transport networks that prioritize modal share and modal shift away from road and air. They are smaller countries, and that's helped them to do that. But that doesn't mean that we can't look at them as lessons of again, these are countries that are not, politically not perfect and not very much not models we want to follow. But that doesn't mean that we cannot understand where some of their strategic planning has reaped benefits. Switzerland's a very strange country in that it's like, hyper Tory, but also has lots of these elements of mass strategic planning, because everyone's collectively realized that actually is quite a good idea. I refer to the coalitions that we're going to need to build coalitions to get this to stick. And Switzerland, perhaps, as well as seeing why transport works well, helps us to understand elements that we can pull out to build some of these coalitions to deliver victory, if you like, or deliver a railway system that fixes the future. Because I say it's not one of the tools, as I see it, and hopefully this book makes the point. Railways are the tool that help us fix the future.
On that note, Gareth, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. The book is out on November the 12th, 2024, but we do encourage you to actually pre-order it. You can pre-order it via repeaterbooks.com. You can pre-order it via Penguin Random House. You can pre-order it via Amazon if needs be.
It's one of those situations. It's one of those situations. If you go to Amazon, it's like it's evil, but also bizarrely probably maximizes the algorithmic ripple effect of more people buying the book. So I don't know what the right answer is in terms of where to buy. People often ask me, where's the best place to buy it? And I say, well, if your objective is more people have the book, possibly Amazon, because it maximizes how much it pushes its people. But also, I'm not going to judge if you don't buy it from an evil company. So to be honest, Repeater, buy it from Repeater. Penguin Random House if you're international. Yeah, lots of options. I'll let others decide where the right thing, but I'm not judging anyone for where they buy it.
Also, of course, don't forget to check out RailNatter, folks. We'll put a link down to that in the show notes. And Gareth, thank you for joining me.
Thanks so much.
We appreciate your support of the imprint and the channel. Subscribe to Zero Books today on Patreon. Your material support helps us to promote a variety of perspectives on the left. Also, discover the many titles, new and old, that Zero has curated. Navigate to any of the links in the show notes to extend your support.